Hey everybody, welcome to One Single Story today. It is April the 19th, day 109. And your reading today would have been 1 Samuel 30. And I'll read a couple of verses and then we'll just kind of begin a conversation about what happens. Just to summarize what's going on, the Amalekites have come and burned Ziklag, which is where David and his people have been living. David and them are off somewhere else. And they take all the women and children, burn the place down, and David chases them. And then there's this thing that happens at the end, which we'll talk about. But I'm going to read a few verses at the beginning. It says, 3 days later, when David and his men arrived at their town of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag. They had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. They had carried off the women and children and everyone else without killing anyone. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. So they've taken their families. David and them have showed up. They haven't killed anybody, which is that says something, you know. But it says they wept until they could weep no more. Been a couple of times in my life where I cried until I felt like I had no more tears left. Like it had run dry. What kind of crisis, events, challenges, struggles, pains, heartaches, whatever it might be, cause us to cry until we have no tears left?
I think the most obvious one is here, the same one that David and his men experienced. When there's some tragedy that's happened to your family, spouse, children, those the closest to you, and it appears initially, as it did in this story, that you don't have a way to fix it or resolve the problem, that you think it may be the end to that. I think that's probably foremost what everybody can identify with.
Yeah, I think when it's so personal, when it is your family, I think those are the things that, I think like we can cry for those that are hurt on like in another part of the world, or we can be upset and and feel pain for other people. But when it is personal, when it's someone you personally knew, or especially like you were saying, family, and something, a tragedy happens, those are the things I think that drain us the most. They take the most out of us because we have such a connection with them, and so losing that I think is probably the thing that for me I think it would that and that time I killed a toad I think are the only two things I think would make me cry until I couldn't cry anymore. But
I mean things that make us cry no more crush us.
Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing here is they didn't immediately turn and go fight. They're broken. They're grieving a little bit first, before they take off. And I think that we have to make room for people who are crushed and affected, broken, if you will, over a situation, and allow them to weep.
Yeah, because grief does a lot of things to us and causes us to react in ways that we normally wouldn't react. And like you said, time and space is important during that. In this story, the very people who had been drawn to David, the outcasts, the misfits, the people who had found a place with David and had so much respect for him, now are talking about killing him.
Yeah.
In this moment of grief and anguish, because I think it's our normal tendency. We need somebody or something to blame as the cause of our loss during that moment, and sometimes we do it in error.
So that was the next question or next part I wanted to talk about is they turn on him
quickly.
They want to stone him.
Yeah.
They had been winning, now they're losing, or they've lost. I don't know that they're losing, but they have lost here. You've experienced some significant loss. As a leader, when you're leading, everything doesn't go perfect. Like, I think sometimes, I look at the president, for example. It doesn't matter who's president. There's close to 50% of the people that hate him. pretty much. You know, they despise. No matter who it is. Like you can
From day one.
insert blank. You know, it's certainly going to be 40 to 45% that just didn't want you to be their leader, and a good percentage of that 40 to 45%. Well, then on top of that, you add the fact that there are some things out of your control. Like you can't determine whether other countries are going to war. You know, you can't determine whether there's going to be a pandemic or not. You know, you don't get to choose those things. They just happen. And people turn on you really quickly as the leader, and they expect you to be able to always have success, even when things happen that you didn't expect. Mm-hmm. How difficult is it to lead in those moments of when things aren't going well?
It's very difficult when you're doing the best that you can do. Like you said, sometimes situations out of your control happen, and you're feeling the same pain that the rest of these folks, and now your pain and trouble is compounded by the folks that you've been trying to lead. And the fact, just prior to this, they were out doing raids and gathering supplies and doing things together. They were experiencing this great victory. No doubt, you know, among them, David was the greatest thing there's ever been. And now on this occasion, almost instantly, there's a complete change. And so he is suffering not only his personal losses, but now all these people that he had been leading have turned against him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and leadership is, I mean, like, this is a test of leadership, even, like, in what he does, and that he goes to God in this, you know, and I think, like, it's easy to be a leader when everything is perfect, when everything is all right, but then when something out of your control, because it is out of his control, happens, and that happens to all of us as leaders, the way you handle it, I think, speaks way more to your leadership than just when things are just going well. You hope that things go well. You hope that nothing goes askew. But those are the times when you really show your leadership and show your ability to lead, is when the going gets tough, when something goes against you.
Yeah, I believe that the test of leadership is not in success. Because if you can't make decisions in success, you'll never make them in failure. Not good ones anyway,
Yeah.
you know. And, you know, or in trouble or in difficulty. And so you have to, just this morning I was listening to a podcast, and they said, he made the statement, he said, 95% of all decisions in any organization could be made by a mature sophomore in high school. 95%. He said leaders don't get paid to make those 95% decisions. They get paid to make 5% of decisions that nobody else either can make or is willing to make, and to deal with the difficult things. And so David is struggling here, and it says, then he said to Abiathar the priest, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought it, and then David asked the Lord, should I chase the band of raiders? Will I catch them? And the Lord told him, yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken from you. So David, before proceeding, is consulting with the Lord. He's in a crisis. He's grieving. The crisis is his family is gone. The second crisis is the people who he needs to get his family back and his people back are turning against him. And he's grieving on top of that. How critical is it, or why should we consult with God before moving forward when everything is already turned upside down? Why should we consult with God in those times?
I think we just need to get in the habit of consulting God at all times, when things are going well, when things are not going well, because you see David, he goes to God all the time, even when things are going well for him, you know, or when he's facing any challenge or whatever the case may be, he is very close with God, and he's always going to God. And so in these times, because I do see this pretty often as well, is that when someone's in a time of grief, they push away God, or they don't go to God. Some people grow closer to God in those times. Some people push him away, and eventually they come back. But David, you see here, though, I think because he has a healthy relationship with God, he does go to God in this time, even when it may be difficult, even when he might be, most people will be maybe upset with God and think, how could God allow this to happen? And so I think we just need to be in the habit of always going to God for wisdom and for everything.
You know, I think the reason this is so important because we rarely make good or our best decisions when our emotions and feelings are involved. And obviously they are at play with David, they're at play with all of these people that have been with him. And so he goes directly to God. He even has the wisdom to, in this moment, bypass his own brokenness and feelings and emotions to even think that I know what's best. I need to hear from God right now.
Yeah, I tell people all the time, I can't think of a time when I've gotten mad and solved a big problem.
Yeah.
You know,
It just
I've
doesn't
made something
work.
worse, but never solved it. So he goes on to say they move in that direction. It says, along the way they found an Egyptian man in a field and brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and water to drink. They also gave him part of a fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, for he hadn't had anything to eat or drink in 3 days and nights. Before long his strength returned. To whom do you belong and where do you come from? I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me 3 days ago because I was sick. We were on our way back from raiding the Kerethites in the Negev, the territory of Judah and the land of Caleb, and we had just burned Ziklag. And David says, will you lead me to these people? And the young man replied, if you take an oath not to kill me or give me back to my master, since he left me here to die. You know, that's not what it says here, but that's the implication. Then I will guide you to them. And so David, he led David to him. This man, a couple of days prior, was the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Now he becomes a friend. How can our enemies become our friends? And should we always be open to allowing... He could have been setting him up. You know, that's the reality of it. He could have been leading him into an ambush, but he wasn't. How should we look for opportunities to allow what was once our enemy into our circle?
I think it depends on the case. It's like, for instance, I think it's always, when it comes to people who maybe I don't agree with or people who are not Christian, I think it's important that we are open to them and that because if we're not, they'll never be able to see who Christ is through us, you know, if we're not open to them. However, I think God gives us the ability, it gives us some discernment and gives us some wisdom in that there are certain people that we should avoid for our sake. For instance, I don't think it's a very good idea to continue to talk with exes, you know, or to continue, like if someone you've broken up with, right? Because there's probably a reason why that ended, usually, right?
Probably.
And so, even though you might see them, even though they might be considered the enemy now, but the thing is, continuing conversation with that might not be the wisest thing. Even though they might not be a Christian, you might be thinking, oh, like it could be an opportunity, like to let them in or talk with them, or maybe they just need some help right now. Sometimes, even though this is not from personal experience, by the way, I'm just gonna say right now, I don't.
I'm trying to decide whether I should interrupt you and save you, or I should let you keep digging a hole.
I promise, this is not from personal experience. I'm just saying, I have seen people who have made, I've had people in my life who have made bad decisions, or talked to people who, even though they thought I'm doing the right thing, I'm doing a good thing, and in that I am being, even not that you shouldn't be kind, but that their kindness can turn into something else, or it can be, you know, it can be dangerous sometimes. Sometimes letting the enemy in, God gives you the ability to discern things for a reason. He gives us wisdom.
Well, let me help you out a little bit. So,
take me a little bit out.
So the whole exes thing, you know, so I do think that there are relationships that are toxic, and they lead us down the wrong path. And so I think there are times that there are people that we should avoid. I also would say that there are times where there are opportunities for reconciliation for the greater good. So let me take the opposite side of that. So I've been divorced and remarried. I have a reasonably good relationship with my ex-wife. And almost all of our conversation centers around the greater good, meaning we're trying to do what's best for our grandkids and our kids. Mm-hmm. And if they're in crisis, you know, we want to have a conversation. Maybe I have some insight or she has some insight that attributes to the greater good. You know, it's enough that at this point, you know, there were problems that led us to apart, but there's also an acknowledgement. Okay, we have to submit to God, and we have to accomplish the greater good here. And you know, she's been here to church to worship, and you know, in services before, and so I don't think all of those relationships. I think if it's a threat to your integrity, the answer is yes. If it's a threat to your relationship with God, the answer is yes. But there are times we have to set aside. You know, they could have just shot this Egyptian and left him for dead.
Yeah, well, if they had left him, he was going to die.
Right.
You know, absolutely. I think the significance and part of the discerning of whether or not you seek a relationship, counsel, interaction from this people is first of all, they treated him with kindness. You know, he's an Egyptian, he's a foreigner to them, and they reach out to him and they give him food and drink, and it's only after that they're able
to find out who he is.
That's exactly right, to find out who he is, and all of a sudden, a person that otherwise they would have ignored, despised, or even killed previously, now holds the information that they need, and he becomes actually the thing or the person that God uses to facilitate getting David where he needs to be in order to take the next step. And I think it's a valuable lesson that when we treat people right, regardless of who they are, that oftentimes God then will allow us to glean information or benefits through that relationship, as simple as it is, that leads us to the next step so that we can move forward with God's plan for us.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So it goes on to verse 20. They go, they kill them all except the ones that escaped on camels. They get everything back. And they bring it back to divide. So there were 200 men that they were too exhausted to go fight, and they stayed back. And when David comes back, he says, so some of the men who went to fight said they didn't go, they don't deserve it. But David said, no, brothers, don't be selfish with what the Lord has given us. He has kept us safe and helped us defeat the band of raiders that attacked us. Who will listen when you talk like this? We share and share alike, those who go to battle and those who guard the equipment. From then on, David made this a decree and a regulation for Israel, and it is still followed today. David said, you got to share with the people who didn't go. Why is this important? Why do you think that is? Because it's so significant, it becomes a regulation that lasts for a long time. You know, even if they don't go, they get a fair share.
You know, he recognized the significance of the contribution that they had made prior to that. They had gone physically, literally, as far as they could go. The scripture says they were exhausted. David and the 400 continued on, and just because they couldn't go where they did and do what they did and what they accomplished didn't mean that they weren't part of the team, that they had previously done everything they could up until that point. And David said, you know, we're not going to abandon them now. In fact, he called them evil troublemakers here, you know, that were starting to stir up this strife and division. And I think it's important to understand that regardless of what role people play in our lives, in ministry, that it is vital, significant, important. And just because they don't do what we do, haven't accomplished what we've accomplished, doesn't mean that they're on equal footing and need to be honored and recognized for that.
It reminds me of a school project. You know, when you do a project with like people you've been like assigned with, maybe you guys did this in school, but you do the project all together. Maybe some other people do certain parts, but then you end up giving the presentation, and maybe you feel like you should get more of the glory because you were the one who did the whole presentation. I put this all together, but they still helped you. They got you to where you were, and even in this story, that they were guarding the equipment, and they still served a purpose. It wasn't that they didn't go at all. I mean, they did participate in some way and help in some way, and as he even says, it's a gift from God.
Yeah, ultimately it's a gift from God. Yeah, so recently we put on display here for a service a replica of Noah's Ark. And it was made for a project at school when one of their kids were in school. But in the conversation, the mom said, and this would have been 12 years or so ago, maybe 15 years ago. And the mom said, you know, it was for the son's project, but the dad really did all the work, and the son got the credit, the son got the passing grade, but it was the dad that did all the work, and the same is true. A lot of times we take credit for victories that we had so little to do with. We were lucky to be there. That's what it was. It was God that was working, it wasn't our ingenuity. So there at the end, just to close, I have a question. He says, when he arrived at Ziklag, David sent part of the plunder to the elders of Judah who were his friends. Here's a present from you, taken from the Lord's enemies. The gifts were sent to the people of the following towns David had visited, and then it lists off the towns and all the other places David and his men had visited. David gives gifts to the leaders, the elders of Judah. Is he bribing them? Is he gaining favor? Is he being wise? Or is he just sharing with them as well? What do you think?
I think he's showing appreciation for all the people that have kept him safe and have taken him in, and I don't think he's doing it with the purpose of bribing them. It doesn't sound like. I think David's a pretty good guy. I don't think he's purposefully going into it being like, I'm gonna give out all the free stuff, give out these Costco free samples, and then they'll all love
these
me.
votes.
Buy these votes for the people. But I think he's doing that way, but it serves multiple purposes, because it does do that. I mean, even if you give someone a gift, I think they feel in a sense, it's indebted to you, or they feel that that it's closer to you. And then when eventually he does become king, that he will garner a lot more favor. People will be like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. He's a good guy. Yeah.
It clearly says that these were people from places they had been previously, which meant they had shown them some degree of kindness and acceptance, or at least tolerated them while they were there in their geographical regions. And here I think he's just overwhelmed with gratitude, because when you come so close to losing something so significant and important and precious to you, and then all of a sudden you recovered, at least I find that for that period of time you become the most generous and kind person there is, because what you thought you had lost was so near and dear, now you have regained it. You just want to be kind and generous to everybody. One of the significant things to me in the end of this story is they went back to Ziklag. They went back to this place of that had been burned, ruined, perhaps still smoldering. He went back to the very place where those emotions just a few days ago were so real and so raw and so fresh, which I think that alone helped create this sense of gratitude to him. When you're seeing it, you're smelling it, you're experiencing over again, and the reality is right in front of you, how can you not have an open and a generous, kind heart toward other people?
This might be a strange example, but what's the name of the gentleman who does grief share? What's his name?
Timothy.
Timothy, yeah. So Tim, I was talking with him in Old Colony.
I was getting ready to ask you that where it was.
Yeah, so it was at Old Colony. And I was talking with him, and he was sharing the story about his son when his son passed away, and that was such a difficult thing. He went through so much grief in that time, and then he went through a grief share, and he learned about how to share his grief. He learned about how to handle grief and get through it with God, and through that, I mean, now he shares that with other people. That was a huge blessing to him, even though he went through that difficult thing, and you never want anyone to go through that, but that was such a powerful thing for him, and he's able to share with other people. Yeah, and that's kind of like with David too. Here, David was able to get everything back. He with that, knowing that it all came from God, he now wants to just share that with other people. I think that's a beautiful thing. I think it's an incredible thing, and shows how God's love for us is like that, in that God goes through so much for us. Christ went through so much for us, sacrificed so much, and that he now, we reap the benefits of what he has done for us, and that he shares that blessing with all of us.
Good. All right, let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you today for your grace. Thank you for the moments that we go through, tragedies that cause us to weep until we have no more tears. And thank you for the times that you give us victory, and we had very little to do with it other than it is a gift from you. Help us to be able to work and care and love people in spite of the victories and the failures. Help us to be able to trust one another and walk with one another when things are going great and when things are not. but most importantly, help us to be faithful to you in all that we